round of applause. Thank you so much for just joining us on this journey. It's been 5 weeks. It feels like we've gone so many beautiful places, and I'm excited for the beautiful places that we're going to go here tonight and for the rest of the quarter. So thank you for joining us here at the Black House. Thank you to the Black House for hosting us tonight, and thank you to all of you for joining us as we've been in movement for the rest of the quarter.
Yeah, as Alon said, this has been really incredible. We had a wonderful night last Friday night. Much to talk about, I'm sure. Much to talk about after tonight. I believe there's going to be a discussion just after class. So if you have time to stick around, certainly feel free to do that. We have a couple announcements. Yeah.
So tonight we continue our collaboration with SAAO. Right after this, there's going to be a concert at Bing Concert Hall, Concert Studio, Dio Gandhi, which I'm really excited about. Can give some love for SAAO. Not only is there a concert tonight, so if you feel like you want to go out and get some fun in, but also there's an artist talk with the artist, and that'll be tomorrow noon at the NAC. We'll come back here. But we just also wanted to let you know about papers. We'll have your papers back to you next week. Thank you so much for all who have joined us in that engagement process. If you are taking the class for 4 units, please start to reach out to us about your final projects and final papers. I would love to talk to you about that. Jackie and I are both available. And also, if you are taking it for 2 to 4 units, your final response paper is due week 8.
Also, for those taking it for 4 units, your abstracts are actually due tonight. It's all right. Got it covered. I know this about you. But we can talk about it. If you need a little bit more time, you need to reach out to us and we'll talk about more time. But I know that it's all right. Look at all this. Look at this. It's all right. It's okay. Reach out to us if you need a little bit more time. But on the syllabus, it does say that those are due tonight because someone has asked me about those. There is an upload portal on Canvas now that wasn't there before, but it is now. So if you're taking this for 4 units, that is where you should upload your abstracts when you have them ready tonight or later than that. That's cool.
Okay, cool. Are those all of our announcements? Yeah, okay, cool. So we're excited to return just to some breathing and to some breath. It feels like it's been a long time, and so I'm excited about that. Okay, cool. So I invite you to just close your eyes if that feels good. If that doesn't feel good, just putting your gaze to your lower register. And we just acknowledge all of the energy that we come into this room with. And we acknowledge that breathing is a central part of the liberation work we do. So much of colonization is about taking us away from our land, but also fracturing us from our bodies. So in this moment of breathing, we begin to reconnect with our bodies, reconnect with our breathing as a portal to this space and to this material world that we are engaging. And so together we're going to take a deep breath in and out with noise. Oh, it's been a while, y'all. Y'all got really cute with the breathing again. All right, let's get a little messy. It's week 5. This is probably the only time we've been asked to breathe intentionally all day, all week. So we want to take some time and express ourselves together in this space. So we'll take a deep breath in and out with noise. Paying special attention to our jaw, which is where we hold a lot of our tension, right? Our jaw, our shoulders, our hip bones, our pelvis, our knees. And so we're going to take another deep breath in, all the way in. And out with breath. And we're just going to keep breathing deeply and intentionally at your own pace. In a moment when the university and the world is telling us to speed up, get things done, move quick, We're responding with some slowness, responding with some breathing. Responding with some listening. We take some deep breaths from our feet, which are grounded in this space. And through our calves, and our knees, and our thighs, our beautiful thighs. Keep breathing into our hip bones. Into our gut. It tells us everything we need to know before we need to know it. Breathing into our heart, our lungs. Letting some of the worry roll off of our shoulders. Off of our necks. Keep breathing into our jawline. Our lips. Our nose. Our eye sockets. Our eyebrows. Our third eyes. The tips of our hair follicles. And that space right outside, above, around the body. Giving thanks to all the ancestors who have met us here in this silence we created together. Blessing our guests and all of us in this space. And with that, we take one final deep breath in and out with noise. One more time. Deep breath in and out with noise. When you're ready, when it feels good for you, feel free to open your eyes. Happy May Day, everybody. And thank you to all of the beautiful organizing that happened around workers' rights today. I know a lot of you in this room made that happen. So without further ado, it is my honor to introduce tonight's guest, Tourmaline. Can we give a round of applause for Tourmaline? Tourmaline is a filmmaker, organizer, and writer. She creates archives of the lives, livelihoods, and resistance of trans people, especially that of Black trans women and trans women of color. She has visual works on Miss Major Griffith Gracie, Marsha P. Johnson, and recently published the book Trapdoor, Trans Cultural Production and the Politics of Visibility. In December 2017, Tourmaline debuted Atlantic is a Sea of Bones, which we'll watch here tonight, a short film on Black trans and queer life, death, Memory and Spaces of Resistance and Memorial in honor of a Day Without Art in 2017, which was commissioned by Visual Aids. So we're excited to watch 3 films. Tourmaline's gonna come up and introduce them, then we will be in conversation, and we're so excited about what tonight will bring. So thank you so much.
So first, I just wanted to say thank you for all the work, paid and unpaid, that went into bringing me here. Organizing an event like this is a huge undertaking, and I really appreciate it. And I feel really honored by all the people who, could be anywhere else, doing a lot of really important things, and yet you came together. And that's what my work is about, us coming together to solve and be and study around huge, really big violences, knowing that our capacity and ability to be with each other and work collectively is, creates the path towards transforming them. So I wanted to say one thing also. I'm in a room with a lot of friends, some who I don't know yet, and some who I've known for a while. And so I'm thankful to be in a room with friends, fellow artists and organizers, people who are staying alive in this moment when we're facing just huge, enormous obstacles to just being alive. So I'm going to show 3 films. The first will be Atlantic as a Sea of Bones, and that is about this person, Egypt LaBeija, who is a friend of mine and amazing artist and performer back in New York City. And I'll share more about the film after. Then next we're going to watch Happy Birthday, Marcia. And the third, we're going to watch a work in progress called Selassie, and that hasn't come out yet. And so it's, my friend Morgan says, it's in progress. So the things that you like, those are the things that are done. The things that you're like, that's what's in progress. I ask that you don't take photos of the last film, or like stream it or IG it, but you're welcome to share the first 2, but if you could not for the third, I would really appreciate that. And I want to give I don't know if you all do content warnings, but just a general content warning. The films deal with violence, violence that we feel inside ourselves, violence enacted against other people. So there are moments of police violence, people cutting themselves, people being harmed, people feeling enormous despair. So I want to give a general content warning for those. Yeah, okay.
I'm wondering how one could think of the Christopher Street Piers as a kind of shawl. I really was so taken aback thinking about the Hudson River as the River Jordan. Mm-hmm. Can you talk a little bit about what that represents, and then what the Christopher Street Piers represent, and kind of the movement, the sort of not even institutional shoals, but the freedom thinking through the shoals, and the sort of multiplicity, the imperceptibility, the illegibility that does good work on the Christopher Street Piers.
That's a great question. And so the Christopher Street Piers, for folks who don't know, are a place in New York City that's along the Hudson River. And it's a space of fugitivity and flight, for people who are often, living life under the gaze of the state, right? So making community, making space together in the face of just enormous violence, and still out there every night and during the day, creating life. And so it was also a place that Marsha P. Johnson used to hang out on. So she called the Hudson River the River Jordan, and often she would take off all our clothes and get naked and offer them up to the River Jordan, and she was a Virgo, in service, to transformation, right? And so, she would often try to take off other people's clothes and put them in the river, and like, what a gift that was, right? To have Marsha like walking naked on Christian Street piers. I think that is like a real Virgo thing. And so, she named them as the River Jordan, as a place of fugitivity, as a place of immense power. And when I made Atlantic as a Sea of Bones, and I used to work the pier, I used to hang out there. It's like the pier is a big part of my life. And so is the Hudson River. Kind of all of my work touches on the River Jordan. And so when I made Atlantic as a Sea of Bones, I was thinking about the poem. How many people are familiar with the poem Atlantic as a Sea of Bones? Yeah, go ahead. Do you want to talk a little bit about it?
I think I would love to hear what you have to say about it.
Okay. It's a short poem. I mean, it's a really short poem. It's one about how huge violences, right, like violences of the transatlantic slave trade, continue to haunt the landscape that we live in today and shape them. Violences that are supposedly over, right? And how the only way to transform those violences, the only way to be in relationship with them, as Lucille Clifton says, is to actually listen to them, right? Something awful is saying our name all the time. And the only way to be in a relationship with it is by listening and answering back. And so I think that is really what underpins a lot of my film work is trying to be in service to and also listening, right? Being receptive to that awfulness that we aren't allowed to talk about, that it gets uncomfortable when we talk about, that we're made to feel ashamed for having survived, that violence, that we're made and told that, something is wrong with us for having endured it. And so, the last film, Salacia, is about this person, Mary Jones, who was a Black trans sex worker who was outlaw, and was a real person who lived in 1803 in New York City, in Soho, and was arrested. And during the course of her arrest, she was outed as trans, and these huge lithographs went up all over New York City calling her a man monster, right? They're we recreated them for the film, and the version that we saw is a 6-minute cut down of the longer film, and we placed Mary in Seneca Village, which is a place that's similar to the Atlantic, right? It's a place that is a sea of bones. Seneca Village was a community in New York City that was the only place where Black people could own land, which meant a particular kind of political power, because at the time in New York City in 1827 to 1855, when Seneca Village existed, the only way to vote was to be a landowner. And so that meant some people in Seneca Village could own land. And it represented kind of a true threat to the city of New York, not just because of voting, but because it was a place, it was like a maroon space, right? It's a place where people who were on the run went to, just like Mary was constantly on the run. And so for the last film, I wanted to give myself increasing permission to tell stories that aren't based on documents that are in the archive, right? Because so many of the documents that we, as students or people who are dealing with the past, interface with are really violent, right? They're calling us man monsters. They're saying we don't exist. They're saying the ways that we do exist are wrong, right? And so I was encountering that problem over and over again when I was making with Sasha Happy Birthday Marsha, or Maryville fame and Celestia, I was encountering, the stories that were told in the archive as really violent ones. And so I wanted to tell a different story, one that was kind of inspired by Sylvia Hartman and also the childhood stories I grew up on, The People Could Fly. I don't know if the people familiar with it. Yeah, okay. And so they're by Virginia Hamilton, and I got permission from Virginia Hamilton's estate to use, The People Could Fly in the film, and that was really wild, just like, when you interact with people who are your heroes, like growing up, and just, it's really profound. And so that story is kind of in service to our capacity to dream, to like ask what if, to speculate, to study, to like ask questions over and over again in hopes of getting deeper each time, and definitely related to the Hudson River.
I love the mix of archive with the created archive of the live action work. And so I'm curious if you could talk a little bit more about that relationship to the archive, in particular the moments that you brought in and how that affected the story that you were telling and the story that you were recreating on film. And just to say, all of them were so gorgeous. It was so good to see them back to back. And so thank you. And also, I'm curious about that relationship.
That's a great question. So when I was, before I was making film, I was organizer, right? So I was like working at different places. Egypt and I, who was the star of Atlantic Sea of Bones, were working on this campaign in New York City to get the welfare office to stop discriminating against trans and gender non-conforming people of color, right? Because every time, and it still happens, and this is like a long tangent to answer your question. Every time, trans and gender non-conforming people go into the welfare office, which is really the only way so many of us can survive, we were being turned away and said, no, come back when you look like a man, or no, come back when you look like a woman. And so, that was a huge obstacle for us just to survive, right? At a time when like trans and gender non-conforming people of color aren't being employed, or don't have access to kind of legal forms of income. Welfare represented a real and continues to survival need, right? And so, Egypt and I and a whole bunch of other people made a big campaign against the welfare office, and we were like, no, you can't treat us this way. And so, we would meet every Tuesday in the Audre Lorde Project and just think about like what do we need to do. We were in study in the kind of Fred Moan sense. We were just asking each other, okay, like what can we do to make this campaign work? And we would just have those kind of Tuesday sessions. And then one day, Egypt came in with this coffee table book, and it was a coffee table book about all photographs of people who were hanging out in the meatpacking district, which is right where Egypt is pointing down in the beginning film, saying, I literally lived right here. And so she was showing me these beautiful photos, and she was saying, this person's dead, this person's dead. And, at the end of it, she was like, I'm the only person who's alive. And it was this profound moment of, being photographed and having a moment captured, but it was also literally captured. She also said, no one asked any of us for permission to be in this book, and they're making so much money off of it, right? And so this, to me, kind of gets to your question of like, the archive is not a neutral place, right? It's a place that often reproduces the violences that were set out to transform, that were set out to fight. And so, for me, when I was organizing, I was trying to get life by finding the kind of bits and pieces of Marcia's life and Sylvia's life that I could, and a lot of times it brought me into people's basements, into people's living rooms, and sometimes into archives, like formal ones, that were also violent places, you know, like whether it was like a security guard, like following, you know, me or my friends into the bathroom being like, you can't be in here, or just what we would find, you know, and how it would talk about people that we really cared about. We would see, you know, the very things that we were against being reproduced. And yet, we found some really amazing things, you know, like I was in Arthur Bell's box, who was this journalist, and I found this like handwritten manifesto by Sylvia Rivera about why Star was important. You know, and I was holding it in my hand, and that moment was so impactful. And I found, you know, this like typed up interview between Sylvia Rivera and this person, Christopher, who was a trans person incarcerated in Bellevue, which was continues to be a psychiatric hospital in New York City. And, you know, thinking how and seeing how very clear it was that, you know, Sylvia and Marcia, people were thinking through a lens of disability justice, right? And also of abolition, not wanting to leave anybody behind, right? Because none of us are free unless all of us are free. And so, to me, the archive represents a place where it's so important to you know, my film practice takes me there. You know, I read Mary Jones' literal court testimony from 1836. So she was arrested in 1836 for pickpocketing someone's wallet, you know, who didn't need the money as much as she did. And so she was sentenced to 5 years in Sing Sing, which was at the time was a prison that we had a mining program, meaning people who were incarcerated there were mining upstate New York for all of the you know, granite that created much of the physical buildings that people who are in New York right now are constantly interacting with, right? So Mary Jones created the infrastructure, like the, you know, and other people who were incarcerated at Sing Sing. And so we're also walking around and moving through like an architectural archive, right, of the imprint and traces of, you know, people like Mary, people who are considered nobodies, who are being told, you know, that we're nobodies, and aren't recounted in the same ways, and as the people whose like name is on top of the building. And so that's also partly what I want my work to be, is in service of nobodies, right? And also not just in making nobody somebody and kind of turning a nobody into like a name, but also showing the kind of richness, the pleasure, and the power of nobodiness, right?
Could you say it again?
Yeah, the richness, pleasure, and power of nobodiness, and how that can also be a source of, you know, self-actualization or collective actualization.
I just wanted to know about, if you, so Sylvia Rivera Law Project, Miss Major, and TGIJP. Could you talk us through the connection between trans justice and prison abolition? You mentioned it a little bit, but this is so much of the work.
Sure.
Do you mind walking us through that a bit?
That's hard to.
Yeah, I don't mind, but I also know that we're in a room full of experts, people who, you know, also live, you know, and have this expertise. So if there are other people who are in the room who want to talk through the connection between trans liberation and prison abolition, also, you know, want to open that up. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course. So, I would say a few things, right? One is like people who are trans and gender conforming, who are gender variant, who are intersex, are navigating prisons, police, ICE detention centers, forced psychiatric institutionalization, navigating like being in the back of a cop car all the time, right? Those are kind of huge forces in many of our lives. And so, and they're shaping our lives. And The Personal Things, which is a film that I did about Miss Major, talks really kind of specifically and poignantly about how our survival is criminalized, right? We're criminalized just for being alive. And so, transliberation seeks to pull back the facade that prisons are kind of like helping us solve any problems, and shows, clearly that actually prisons, police, jail, punishment is actually one of the biggest barriers to actual healing, right? Harm happens, but a prison doesn't save us from harm, and in fact, it increases harm. And so, another part of the abolition work that I do is reminding us that, transgender nonconforming people started this movement, right? The rebellion at Stonewall was against the police. And in part, it was about the criminalization of publicness of trans and gender nonconforming people of color, people who were disabled or homeless or houseless. Because at the time in New York City, you had to, if you were, assigned male at birth and you were a trans person, you had to wear 3 articles of quote unquote male clothing, or you'd be arrested and put in jail. They were called anti-cross-dressing laws. And people are like, wow, that's so intense. And that was the what then NYPD used that night to arrest people under the auspices of violating this moral code, right? The moral of the state. But what doesn't often, and I'm really get in the conversation, is that those anti-cross-dressing laws are actually still alive in prisons and jails today, right? If you're a trans or gender nonconforming person and you're currently incarcerated, you actually are penalized for stepping out of a very specific attire, right? And so, the prisons are constantly not only acting as barriers to healing, not only acting as huge forces of violence that shape our lives, but they're also reproducing the gender binary, in a very kind of specific way. And so, transliberation is a call for prison abolition.
We're going to open it up in just a few minutes. I'm going to ask one more question. Please. I want to return to the last question, and then also something that you were saying before about kind of creating an anti-archive in some ways, which is just phenomenal and mind-blowing in the ways that there's invention and imagination happening to sort of transform and not only raise to the surface, but potentially transform the violence of the past. But I want to know, given what you're saying about the ways in which the gender binary is reinforced, that criminalization of being is so critical to film, kind of creating an anti-archive from the title and the question of salaciousness and obscenity and indecency and improper sexuality, etc. The theme of flight and sort of refashioning Mary Jones as a witchy bitch, who can do magic to transform things, even in the moment. What are there's a theme, you're showing us criminalization of so-called aberrant gender, right? But what are the ways in which you're using, drawing on Virginia Hamilton and The People Could Fly, maybe also Song of Solomon, maybe also Brer Rabbit in this sort of trickster kind of situation, and also the business of sex and sexuality itself, the ways that those things are coming together, the sort of erotics of the bleeding and all these things that are going on, to try to comment on or teach us something, not only about flight and transformation, but about the question of criminalization of gender and sexuality themselves.
Coming with it. So good.
That was a great question. And I feel like in part you saved me a lot of work because you answered it.
So maybe that's it. Oh my God, I love this film. So much is going on. But so I'll make a different question that's a little bit. What are the things that you hope that we get from Salacia around the theme of flight?
Yeah. I mean, I think that what so often those things that were made to feel really shameful about ourselves are the very things that are urgently needed in this moment of escalated violence, to bring to the foreground if we're going to continue to figure this thing out, right? And so, there's a ritual around this incredibly violent object, which is the man monster poster, right? And I remember seeing it for the first time, and then I remember reading Mary's actual words, right, about the case. And part of what my work seeks to do is, in a very public way, take and show the wounds that are created, right, that we're all kind of walking with and moving with and living with, and show that they're also inextricably linked to our capacity to transform the world, right? All of those things that we're told are bad, and the many ways that we are hurt because of them are not separated and can't be separated from what we need to show and share with the world right now. So whether it's Mary's sluttiness and her sexual power, or whether it's a place of what happened with Seneca Village is the state kept used the language of this. It continues to happen, of moral panic, right? Like, there's a lot of moral panic about Seneca Village because people who were on the run landed there and collectively built up power, right? And so it was called, and you can find these articles in the New York Times about it, it was called just like, a bone-boiling nuisance, or like the rank odors of Seneca Village can be smelled, for miles, and kind of all of these ways that our communities continue to be narrativized, right, are in that archive. But it also is a good roadmap to our power, right? And to flipping it and turning it out, kind of just like what Mary was doing with that poster.
Speaking of that, can you talk about the bathtub as a portal, which shows up, I think, all throughout the work?
Yeah. I mean, to me, the bathtub is a portal. That's kind of just what it is. It's also I'm a Cancer, and it's like, and so I'm just kind of those places of the estuary, the river, the bathtub. In Salacia, the scrying bowl are all places of intuition, of receptivity, of like receiving as a gift, and to me, they're also places that connect in a like non-linear timeline, time. And so, like, when I'm moving around New York now, I can't unsee Seneca Village, and I can't unfeel the power of Marcia and Sylvia, like, kikiing on Christopher Street, and I can't not experience Egypt, in all of her glory, hanging out in the Meatpacking District. And part of what holds those moments are bathtubs, is the water, is the River Jordan. And so I think that's part of what's going on
there. So one of the big questions we're asking is how can art facilitate a culture that supports women, trans folks, girls, caregivers? I know there are limits to that, and so I'm just curious your feelings and your experience around that very question, and even if you want to push around the limits of that, but also the possibilities of art and actual material transformation of actual people's lives.
Yeah. I mean, I think, part of what I hear when I think about a question like that is about the violence that we're experiencing on a day-to-day level doesn't just affect our material condition, right? It doesn't just affect how much money we have in our wallet, our ability to get a job or have housing, or like just all of the materialness of our lives, but also affects us on at least how I understand it and experience it, on a profoundly immaterial way, right? Like, it affects how we feel about ourselves. It affects our connection with our breath, right? And it affects, our spirituality. It affects profoundly, many ways that the immaterial shows up in our life. And to me, I understand myself as a person who's organizing in a different way, more of like a cultural organizer. But also my film, the specific ones, the frame, and also what happens behind the frame, is about material organizing, but it's also trying to offer up in service of like greater transformation around immaterial. The ways that we were harmed, the stories that were told about us, how we can flip that out, how we can build power around that. Just like, Mary with the man monster poster, or, Egypt in the bathtub. To me, art, how I experience it, might not change the world in the way that some people imagine world changing to happen, but I think that's also a good thing. But it certainly changes my world, right? And those two aren't separate. And so I think that is why, I was an organizer for a long time, and a lot of my friends were dying. It's like, that was just what, many of us who are part of these communities it's a lived reality, right? There's, that quote about the life expectancy for like trans women of color being like 35 years, and that's real, I don't, like, I'm not a big believer in statistics or whatever, probably tell from my work, but like that's actually a real experience that many of us have. Like, we are losing people all the time, and it was really causing me to I carry it, I feel it, and the thing that was giving me life in a moment of immense death, and those things aren't in opposition with each other, right? Life and death are not, in opposition. But the thing that was giving me life was making art. That was the thing that I would go home and I would collage every day. I would work with photographs that I was taking. I would write these stories about, Sylvia and Marcia, or think about Mary time traveling, or kind of just all of these things. And that, to me, was getting at this part of myself that kind of organizing in a different way wasn't doing. And so for many of us who are dealing with that level of violence, I think art is fundamental, and just how we feel about ourselves, as people collectively, and also to return to things like our breath, right? To return to our sense of power.
Okay, so unfortunately, our mics are not cordless tonight. So if you have a question, you'll have to stand up and project, and if necessary, we'll repeat the question from here. Is that all right? Yes, I will repeat it every time, actually. All right. So questions? Any questions?
No?
Yeah, so as a filmmaker, and interested in film, I was interested in the last film when you had the juxtaposing frames of I guess beginning scenes, or just a lot of scenes going on, and also the background imagery, like the moon and birds flocking. I was interested in what essentially the tonality and what are also kind of metaphor or things you were trying to get across when you were doing that, just from a film point of view.
That's a great question. So I think part of it was going back to my early days before I knew that I could do film. Because for me, it was, part of what I try to do is bring to the foreground people who are largely excluded historically from film, and not just like through what you see on the frame, but also the process. So on the last film I had, on our last shoot day, anyone who wanted to direct from like, a 4-year-old young person who was visiting their parent on set to, people who were in like support roles to, hair and makeup to the grip and the gaffer to the stunt people, because in the longer film there's like a lot of fight scenes. Like literally anyone, if you just were stopping by the set that day, you were offered the opportunity and invited to direct a sequence. And so part of what I was trying to do is, flip something, right, about who gets to tell a story, right? And film to me is a lot about story. And then the frames also are about story in that I wanted to bring the reference to the story that has kept me alive, The People Could Fly, right? And the kind of storytelling that happens in that, and also the visual, like the actual aesthetic, right, of that. I wanted it to feel like you were flipping through a story. And then also kind of one thing that plays out in just my thinking a lot is about the figure in the ground, right? So the ground is in kind of an aesthetic terms like the canvas, and the figure is what is legible as like, like a painting of a person, right? So a lot of times we think through the figure for key moments in history, or just who's important in the room, or what we should be paying attention to, and we don't really think about the ground, right? We don't think about all maybe the labor that was unpaid or stolen in order to see that figure, right? All the people who were pushed to the back in order to make that like highly visible mark legible to us. And so I also wanted to aesthetically bring forth the ground, right? Like film, movie magic is so incredible, right? Because it can make things look seamless, but also it can invisibilize the immense amounts of labor that happens to make film possible. And it's so much, like when I was watching the credits for Happy Birthday, there's just like so many, there's hundreds of people involved, and that's like, so to me, it was really important to, it's always important to bring the ground to the foreground and make a figure of it, and also destabilize the idea of the figure itself. And then there's some that I was just like, oh, that's beautiful. Like, I want to see the moon more, or I want to see the water, right? Yeah.
Yeah, please, if you'd like to. That was good.
Hi, my name's Kate. I just want to thank you so much for being here. I've been thinking a lot about connection to trans history, especially since the trans community doesn't have a direct line of ancestry like the Camellia would. And we've talking a lot about dreaming and what a different future could look like, but it also seems like you have an intimate interest in the past. And I think that's something that, at least personally, I forget a lot in ways that I'm trying to reinvent myself, and a lot of focus on the individual. So I guess I just wanted to ask about your interest in the past and how you see that relating to dreams.
So, just for documentation, I've been told I need to repeat those so that we can hear some beautiful questions. The question is about the trans past, about history and investment in history, in addition to investments in the future and making and moving forward, thinking about ancestry and lineages.
So one of the texts that I'm always kind of just thinking alongside of is Sylvia Hartman's Venus in Two Acts. Are people familiar with it? And so in it, she talks about, how do you tell a story about people who aren't in the archive, right? When the only kind of trace of a person's life is in the ledger of an insurance book from a ship carrying people, you know. Thank you. So she was talking about a slave ship that went down, right? And the people whose lives were recorded were only recorded on the insurance ledger, right? For the people who owned the ship to get more money from the insurance company. And she was asking, like, how do you tell stories about us when that's what shows up in the archive? And to me, I take that question really personally, and I want to, my work is working through that question, right? Just thinking about history in ways that don't reproduce that kind of violence of like the archive. And partly that's why I use things like science fiction and fantasy, because I want to kind of both illuminate the, like, you know, artificiality isn't a bad thing, but like the artificiality of history based on an archive, right? And say, like, you know, something that I can share is much more truthful than this newspaper that's calling Mary a man monster, or these questions that are being asked of her about whether she stole this wallet as they get ready to ship her off to Sing Sing to build New York City, you know? And I think that's what, that's kind of what my interest in the past is. And also just a deep acknowledgement for all of the life and labor that got me to where I am right now. You know, from Mary to Sylvia to Miss Major to Marcia to the names that I'll never know because of the violences that we're all living through. Other questions? Other questions?
Throughout the 3 films, I noticed I was kind of like stricken by like the 2 like black like male presenting. I only noticed like 2 black like male presenting actors, so I was wondering like sort of the intentionality there. I'm not including like the police, just but the police. Question number 1. Question number 2. Actually, that's no question.
Thank you for your question. The intention of my work is a few things. It's about sharing the beauty and power and the kind of complicatedness, right? So people like Marcia didn't only act in historic ways, like starting Stonewall, like people like Sylvia, you know, like they hurt each other and they did things that were like, oh, that wasn't cool, you know, so people were complicated, right? So my work is about trying to show those kind of contradictions and complications of people who have been pushed to the side. And it's also about like gender self-determination, which is also like gender collective indeterminacy, meaning one of the ways that like so many trans folks are harmed is like by being clocked in a particular way that isn't necessarily congruent with how we understand ourselves. And so what was important to me was like I don't know everyone's gender on screen because it like changes like the tides all the time. Like one day on set, like, you know, people are you know, experiencing and articulating their gender in one particular way. And then, you know, when the film comes out, actually it's a whole different thing. And then 5 years later, you know, it's a beautiful new iteration. And so I think to me, you know, that's really important to like bring into the room, and also how that like places of violence make gender seemingly static, you know, and clockable. So like, you know, there are so many women in quote unquote men's prisons. And one of the kind of biggest lessons that I had to learn was like, I didn't actually know you know, like many of us have to learn this, right? Because we're not taught it. Like we don't actually know what the gender of the person is, you know, who is like walking in front of us. We do know that these like huge structures enforce a kind of presentation that make gender legible in a particular way. So I just wanted to like, yeah, also bring that into the room of like, you know, even the people I know, like I don't know sometimes, you know, what their gender is. And then, you know, I think that some of the people who maybe you are reading as mass presenting might be femme and might not be, you know, and so I think that, that's part of it, you know, is destabilizing the notion that we can necessarily know what someone's gender is without like having a conversation with them. And it's hard too because I didn't have a conversation with Mary, you know, and so there's that kind of real moment that I'm asking myself all the time, which is, am I portraying people in a way that is truthful to how they're experiencing themselves? And it's really hard to do when there's not like a direct material line, right? And so partly that's why I move kind of more slowly than other filmmakers maybe, because a lot of it is about like using my intuition, going into the archive, trying to figure out what people said about themselves, you know, and then not necessarily naming people outside of those words that people used, you know, and then also doing some translation work. So it's complicated, and I think that your question is really a really important one that gets to all of those underpinning issues. So thank you.
Other questions? You want to do another one?
Yeah, sorry. Last one.
Do it. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. So, it's like a paraphrase, but we talked about earlier how like the importance of art, like what it means to like build a culture. So it's like art is a medium in which world change can happen through building people and communities up. Just knowing that and knowing that you spoke about how you were organizing the community before this, what made you switch to filmmaking? Or, you know, knowing that both of these mediums do community building and world changing. And also, which one do you prefer?
That's a great question.
Yeah, that's a very good question. You know, so the first time I made a film, it was with this group called the Welfare Warriors. That it doesn't exist anymore. It was, you know, Queers for Economic Justice was this big group in New York City that organized with people who had experienced poverty or are currently living in poverty. And a little like mini part of that was called the Welfare Warriors. And we wanted to make a film about our lives. We thought, you know, we have some important things to say, and we did. And we had some important issues to talk about, like welfare and healthcare and housing and the police and disability, all of which are like deeply underpinned by, you know, ongoing anti-Blackness. And so we made a film, and it was called Taking Freedom Home. You can probably watch it on YouTube. And it was powerful. Like the filmmaking process was powerful. And my friend who made it, Kagendo, died a year ago. And you know, Kagendo is a really amazing filmmaker. And so it had a real impact on my life to go into a room like this and put up a screen and, you know, have people watch like our stories and be moved by them, be called by them, be seen by them. And at the same time, you know, so that was part of how I was organizing. That was like 10 years ago. It started in 2007 and we ended in 2009 with the films. And so, you know, I was touching on it a little bit before, but like at the same time, you know, our community was dealing with enormous loss, right? So like people, it's not an overstatement to say like I was going to a funeral or a memorial like once a week, many times a month. And ultimately, I found that while organizing in that specific way is transformative and collective action is so urgently needed right now, what I needed to do was take a pause. You know, if we're living in a protracted, you know, it's a protracted struggle. It's a multi-generational, intergenerational struggle. I needed to pause the ways that I was, you know, organizing, which was like I was doing a lot of campaigns around stopping the welfare office from being so fucked up, campaigns around getting healthcare for low-income transgender non-conforming people because New York State specifically denies it. You know, like I was campaigns to stop prisons from being built, but that work wasn't necessarily feeding me. You know, and in a moment of incredible loss, I needed to make space for that, and so that's what I was, you know, initially doing with my film work, was kind of making space for those feelings. I was like trying to make a bathtub out of a movie, you know? And so I also think that I won't necessarily just stay with filmmaking. You know, it's like, to me, it's not an either or. And I also think that like filmmakers and artists and cultural workers are part of movement, right? Or part of movement building. And so, like, I'm gonna stay with it for a while. You know, there's stories that I really want to tell. You know, I was talking to Eric about like how I want to make the next Star Wars, like literally, you know. And so, like a Mary Jones Star Wars, you know. And so, like, there's a story that I want to tell, but also that's not separate from being in the world in like an abundance of ways. You know. Yeah.
Any final questions?
I think we have time for one more, and then we'll do a closing for.
Okay.
Wait.
Oh, okay. That's 2 quick ones. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Here, great. Okay. Okay, then we'll end too. Oh. And then we'll end with you. Your question.
I love your shoes. They're so good. But in your films and the talk, you talked a lot about flight. But I noticed they all have a lot of movement and movement of the body and movement with each other and movement self. And so I was wondering how you envision movement not only in your art but in your practice as a form of liberation for you in the future.
To me, the Happy Birthday Marsha, all of the films are about people's contradictions and movement, and also stillness, right? And what's important is to show like Sylvia didn't show up to the really important night, and that's what the film is about. Like, where were Marsha's friends? Like, I would have been so upset. And so that is the mess. Right? That's the mess on film. People getting high and like we do, and forgetting like we do. And that forgetting hurting other people. And that to me is the story of Happy Birthday Marsha, right? Like our interdependency, our contradictions, us not being pure, right? And kind of pushing back against the violence of like a purity politic, that people can only be heroic, or people can only not have a trauma brain, and forget things. And then also like, it goes back to your question of like, the non-opposition of stillness and flight, right? So we can't all flee in the same ways, and Mary, like, people were like, take us with you, and they weren't running with Mary, and so I think that to me is really important to kind of bring in, some people flee through getting high, some people flee through dreaming, some people flee through like breaking out of the prison, some people, all of the ways and all of the tools that we have for flight are really important. And like it's also against the kind of hierarchy of like which tools are the most important. Sure. I just want to say, thank you. I think it's Wednesday? For spending your Wednesday night with me talking about like people and moments and places that are really meaningful, which isn't like separate from everyone in this room as a person and moment and place that's really meaningful and really urgently needed to kind of be in study about how we can move forward and back in time, but out of this moment of immense violence.
I just want to thank you so much, Tourmaline. For all that labor, I think just ending with a couple more breaths. Yeah? Yeah. So all together, deep breath in, out with noise. Just hold that for a second. And again, just all the labor we see and we don't see, all the sacrifice and joy and togetherness and messiness. Deep breath in. And out with noise. And one more time for the road, yeah? Deep breath in. All the way in, all the way in, all the way in, all the way in. And out with noise. Thank you so much again. Thank you, everybody.